Hi, I'm Joe Gimenez, and I do public relations work for TEXPERS and pension funds around the state. And boy, we learned a big lesson in public relations in the last week. Do not get on stage and make comments and jokes about people's wives' hair. So that's a lesson learned. We're not going to do that today. We are here today to talk about pension obligation bonds. In the last legislative session, the legislature passed 3898, which requires pension funds to create plans for how they're going to move from anything above 30 years of amortization period below 30 years. And if you don't do that within a few years, you're going to be asked to do it anyway as part of an FSRP process, and then the guidelines get more strict down to 25 years. Is that pretty much the way you understand? Yeah. So pension funds today have a lot of reason to look at where they are with their amortization period, because you don't want to be hauled up to the to the pension review board and have to go through that process. It's not fun. So there are a lot of ways that pension funds can do that in terms of bringing their amortization period down. But one of the options that's available is pension obligation bonds, where your city issues a municipal bond, tax-free to investors, that pays off or adds money to the amount of funding that your pension fund has to invest. And so it's certainly, as pension funds look at how to bring that amortization period down, you might be thinking of all of the above: contribution increases, benefit cuts maybe, increased contributions from the city, or lump sum payment from your city. So there's different options that you have available to you. So what our focus today is pension obligation bonds, and we have here two representatives of two great funds in Texas, Tyer Grossman from El Paso and Kolby Beckham from Longview, the firefighters there, and Tyer manages the police and fire pension fund in El Paso. And we're going to start with Tyer because in El Paso's case, they issued bonds back in 2007, 2009, which he's going to tell us about and how that went. And then Kolby is going to add a little bit of information afterwards about what's going on in Longview, because they have an active pension obligation bond issuance and vote in the next month for $45 million in pension obligation bonds to help Longview. So that's our lineup for today, and so I just thought I'd turn it over to Tyer and tell us about the situation that you had in 2007 and what y'all did and where y'all are now.
So for El Paso, obviously our road to the pension obligation bond started way before that. So in '94, we finally took over all of our administrative duties from the city as to include the actuarial assumptions and how that all worked. And lo and behold, to our surprise, when we did the calculations using the correct mortality rate, yeah, I think they still had it 55. So we ended up being in '94, $40 million underfunded. Of course, at that time, the city told us to go pound sand and not giving us anything. And so over a 10-year period, that $40 million turned into a $400 million problem. It moves quickly. And so we finally were able to get into some serious conversations with the city, and of course they wanted us to share the burden of that. And so we did end up going to a second tier, but in the process it was a 50-50 split, so we ended up giving up $200 million worth of benefits, and they gave us $200 million through a pension obligation bond. In our statute, it actually is already there where the citizens of El Paso have to vote on any lump sum given to the fund. And so we did go through that process. Obviously, it's a long and tenuous process. And, obviously, it can get mundane at times, but you have to stay diligent. You have to get through it. We did get the citizens to vote. The city decided that they did not want to issue all 200 million in 1 year, and so they gave us the first $100 million in 2007. And of course, the debate at the time was, what do you do with this lump sum that you just got? Do you, dollar cost average? Do you hold it off to the side and try to pick what you want to invest in? Or do we do what we normally do is, we're here for the long term, we're here forever, you're investing forever, so you put that money in the diversification that you already have and you let it play. Of course, in 2007, that was probably the worst time to ever do it, so that didn't work out well for us. So we had to fight with the city on that one, and what's wrong with you people? You guys are stupid. So we had to deal with that, and then, but because they took 2 years to give us the second $100 million, they actually ended up having to give us $115 million because we charged them the interest on that. And they gave that to us in June of '09, and so we did the same thing with that money, and it could have been the best time. So yeah, we were geniuses after that. But at the time when we were going through this fight, we were $400 million underfunded. We were only, at the time, a $600 million fund. And so, by taking that money, obviously, and diversifying it the way we had our allocation in place, we're now a $1.9 billion fund. So it's actually worked out extremely well for us. It wasn't immediate. Obviously with the financial crisis, it was still, even getting that money in June of '09, there was still a process. We were, still infinite for a couple years, and then we slowly and gradually, as the returns did well, we've gotten ourselves from infinite in 2009 and 10 to where we are now, which is at 26, 28 years. And so it's worked out extremely well for us. The city at the time when they did those obligation bonds, they've had the opportunity to refinance those, and so over the longevity or the time period they have to pay that back, they're actually going to save an extra $55 million. So there are options for the city too. It's just not one and done, they just forget about it. There's options for them to try to save on those monies as well. So it's worked extremely well for us.
So one of the things that was mentioned at the last PRB meeting was taking pension obligation bond money and guarding against potentially turning it into immediate new benefits for firefighters and police and munis. What happened in your case in El Paso? And we're going to talk more about that with Kolby in a second. But what happened with that kind of working out with the city? What you were going to do?
So part of our negotiation process with the city was actually to change items in our state statute. We are under 6243B, and it was added in our statute that any benefit changes that we have, obviously it must first go to the board, then it must go to an actuary, and they have to determine a cost, and if that cost would hinder the fund, then they will, because you have to have a plan as to how you're going to pay for it, and then it will go to the members, and then the city has to sign off on it as well. City council has to vote on it as well. So the way we have it is, if you are going to give a benefit to the members, then someone has to pay for it. There is no, it doesn't matter if the fund's 120% funded, you can't give a benefit and only take it down to 100%. You can't change it so in any way, shape, or form unless somebody's paying for it. So, and we have done that in 2017. Our second tier, the members, the board members, actuary, and the city all signed off on lowering from 25 years and 50 years of age to retire. We lowered it for tier 2 to 45 and 20 years. And we did so by determining what the cost would be to give them, let them retire earlier. And then the members decided to give a little bit more on top of that in order to pay down our underfunding. So at this time, we actually match our city at 18%. But we do have those safeguards in place so that you can't just give benefits away. You can't pass obligation bonds in order to do it. I guess theoretically you could, but the problem is it really comes down to contributions. It's not a matter of, because once you give that lump sum, if you're still not paying your normal costs, that problem still exists. It's just it's just going to delay you some. And it's helped us out tremendously, but when we did that pension obligation bond, it was to get us to 80% ratio. And we've maintained that. We're a little bit above right now, but it was never meant to get us to 100%, but that's for a future battle.
Your amortization period right now is?
It's 26 for the fire side and 29 for the police side.
So comfortably below 30.
We're comfortably below right now. And we had a good last 2 years, so we'll be comfortably even lower, so that's good.
Good, okay. So this is Kolby, of course, and Kolby has been in the news quite a bit in Longview for the last several months, talking about a process that they've initiated, had to have been some time ago, probably in 2021, to think about this. I know that there has been, back and forth with Longview and the Pension Review Board over a period of several years, and maybe you could just give the audience a feel for where y'all have been, and then where you are now with your city council.
Well, I guess going back and looking at where all this began, it began like many funds in the state in the 90s. Funds were making incredible returns, tech stocks, and they were all approaching or reached 100% funding, at which point in an attempt to protect the contributions, they were making benefit improvements to the plan that they felt were going to keep us from going above and losing that. They made them, unfortunately, much like Tyler talked about, at the absolute worst possible time. As these changes came into effect, the tech stock bubble pop, 2001 happened, relatively flat market, housing bubble of 2008. And it was the perfect storm that took us from a fully funded pension fund down to roughly a 40% pension fund funding status as it stands today. I started on the board in 2007, right before the 2008 housing market change. And during my 15 years, all we have done is cut benefits, increase contributions, and create a tier 2. So I will say, before you look at something like a pension obligation bond, you have to make sure that you've taken care of your house. If you're bleeding, getting a blood transfusion is never going to help you if you haven't stopped the bleeding. So I think that's a relative first step that you're going to have to look at, whether it's pension spiking or employment issues or benefit issues. You have to go through that process and figure out where the root problem is and start to address those. So the city of Longview and ourselves have been working together since about 2011, and we've been taking multiple steps trying to address that unfunded liability. We actually were down to 40.2 years amortization period at one point, and then we had a terrible year. And on top of that, there was a lot of pressure to change your assumed rate of return, which was obviously going to put a negative impact on there. And mortality table came out specific to police and fire, which turned a lot further than what we thought. So we went ahead and made all those changes and ended up right back at infinity for our unfunded liability. Yeah, members love that too. So from there, we're trying to figure out what is going to be the best option. And I have to give a lot of credit to our actuarial firm who brought to us the idea of transitioning some contributions. And TLFFRA statute, it requires that as long as the employee is making a 12% contribution, that the city has to match at a 12% contribution. You can go above that. Our city contributes at 19, our tier 1 contributes at 17, our tier 2 contributes at 15. And we approached the city with a cost-neutral plan of taking that gap between the state minimum of 12% and 19 and take that 7% and use that to purchase a pension obligation bond. And that was the original idea that we brought to the city. TLFFRA funds have 2 city representatives that serve on the board, mayor or his or her designee, in our case it's a council member, and the chief financial officer, which she serves on our board. So we presented that idea to those 2 individuals who went back to the city budget team and presented the idea to them. I got the phone call to come down to the meeting, and that more than likely I needed to have another plan in my pocket besides that. So I went into that meeting really not expecting much, and I was fortunate enough that we were in the process of changing city managers. The assistant city manager was going to become the next city manager, or certainly appeared to, and the current city manager was in his final months of employment before he moved on to retirement. And coming from the Public Works Department, the assistant city manager was very familiar with bonds, very familiar with the issuance of them and how it worked. And we actually laid the plan out, and he had done a lot of homework ahead of time, and a lot of credit to him. He basically said, this makes perfect sense. So our city hired an independent actuary. They didn't want to just take the numbers from what the fire department had given to them to basically confirm that the unfunded liability was correct, that we were looking for, that the numbers that we were using were correct, and basically given an independent recommendation as to what they felt was going to be the appropriate amount. From there, they came back with a cost-neutral option of $33.3 million, a middle-of-the-road option that was a little over $45 million, and then, of course, paying the whole amount off. The recommendation was not to pay the whole amount off because you might find yourself in that same situation of 100% funded before you even have the bond paid off, and now you're making benefit improvements possibly, and you're still making payments on the loan. So we were hoping for at minimum the 33.3, and actually, because the city's on a different measuring scale of the GASB formula versus the formula we use in the pension world, it helped them to go to the middle ground right there in the way of their GASB numbers, which of course affects their bond ratings from there. So we're in the process right now of the politics side of business. May 7th is our election. So on top of the 7% contribution deferral to the bond payment, we're asking for 2 pennies on the tax rate to be added to the citizens. And that comes out on May 7th. So we've been in the politic world of trying to explain that to everybody, and we've received a lot of support. And the education of, in 2025, this is not an option. And just like Tyler said, their $40 million problem grew to a $400 million problem. Our biggest sales pitch is usually when you go for a bond, you want something. I want a new fire station. I want new streets. I want new sewer. We already own this. It's not going away. It's not, if we vote it down, it's not going to be there. This is something we owe, and this is the cheapest, most cost-efficient way of tackling this problem and moving forward. And that's been our experience so far.
Great. And the campaign, how is that going? I mean, what are you doing, and how do you think that's going to go?
So we have a PAC fund that's part of our association that has really helped take the lead on the financial aspect of going through the process. Of course, yard signs, banners, education, a big Q&A article through the newspaper. We also have it posted on the website. Of course, the city themselves cannot really support or not support the bond. They can just provide information. On duty, we're not allowed to do any type of political activity, so we're really limited to our off-duty activities. And so we've made campaigns going out. We have a mailer going out. The association has actually reached back to the state association, which actually has I guess an online media outlet that will help with these types of campaigns to make sure that we're getting the online presence out there to the community, because a lot of people, I am not a social media person personally. I'm not a fan, but I know a lot of people are. I'm the minority in that situation. But so we have the representation there. We got the face-to-face, and it's a May election, to be honest with you. Less than 1% of the public shows up to a May election. So you have to get the voter rolls, figure out who's showing up to vote, and get out there and knock on those doors and talk to those people.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yes, sir.
Kolby, I congratulate you. I can only imagine the amount of work that took. So congratulate you for getting this far. It sounds like a real thoughtful shared sacrifice, everybody coming together. What's the argument of the opposition?
In our case, our opposition has not really spoke against our bond. They spoke against a bond that was passed 4 years ago for streets and parks and fire stations and police stations, saying that if we knew we had this debt, why did we issue this other debt? But we actually haven't had an opposition directly against the bond that we're passing, just more so about the lack of transparency of the debt that was there when the first bonds were issued.
Tyler, was there a vote? Did you say there was a vote in El Paso?
Yes, there was.
How did that go?
It went the same. Normally if the associations and pension and the city are all on the same page because they work together to come to a conclusion, then things normally turn out just fine. And so the only people that will speak against are usually the same people who speak against everything else that anybody tries to do. So it really does help when you join forces and you come to a conclusion that will benefit everybody. And so we actually had a relatively easy time passing that.
Yeah, I think the last pension obligation bond vote was in Houston in November of 2017, and that was for $1 billion, and that passed by a 3-to-1 margin in Houston at the time. So in general, I think that these are being favorably viewed by voters and city folk. So yes, sir.
Those bonds are separate and distinct from the contributions. The raising of the contributions and us matching were in different conversations and different things over the years. And so them paying it back was never part of our negotiations. It was simply on the city's side. Yes. Yes, the debt is owned by the city. Unlike Kolby's, we didn't negotiate that. We didn't take on that. Yeah.
Any other questions right now? I've got some for Kolby. Yes, sir.
What is the pension obligation for the city's bond rating?
So
The question was, what did the pension obligation bond do for the city's bond rating in El Paso?
I think the best part of it was back in, let's say, 03 to 04, the city was taking the view that our underfunding status of $400 million wasn't really a debt, and so they didn't have to carry it on their books. That was the best part about the whole conversation with the city. And obviously, once anybody that had any common sense let them know that no, that is a debt on your books, and you need to take care of it. That's when they finally came to the table, because it was going to ruin their bond rating. And so with that money, obviously it turned the tide for them quite well. And so their bond rating has done quite well because of that. So it didn't hurt them to bring on the debt. Obviously it is debt, but it was to take care of the underfunding that we had. So it was almost like a wash for them at that particular moment in time. The only thing that's hurting them now on the bond rating is that we have a fixed rate of return, or that 18% is fixed. And so we're working on trying to remove that as well. So.
And Kolby, you'd said that the GASB improvement was attractive to the city for moving it from 33 to 45. Is that, tell us a little bit about that.
Well, obviously the calculation is different on how the GASB, I've always tried to compare it to the doomsday worst case scenario. Everybody walks out, everybody takes their money. When you hit that crossover point of where you go to the new blended rate. And when you go to the blended rate, it's the highest municipal bond mixed with your current assumed rate of return. Well, as interest rates fall, that blended rate goes down. When that blended rate goes down, our unfunded liability is $70.6 million. On the GASB statements, I think as of our last day, was $212 million. So as interest rates will start to rise, that number will turn around. And the further away that you can get away from that crossover rate, you can keep your assumed rate of return. And for us on the GASB funding status, I want to say we were closer to the 60 to 65% funded ratio on the GASB side at the 33, where we were about 72% funded on the traditional way that we have always calculated it actuarially. And going to the $45 million instead of the just cost neutral $33 million plan. It put us to about 85% funded is where we will end up if it passes. And it also puts us on the GASB side, I think more like 75% funded, which of course is attractive for the bond rating. My understanding in communication with our finance officer and the bond lawyers and the rating agencies that we of course have been dealing with every year, what are you doing about your pension debt? What are you doing about your pension debt? They want to see that you have a plan. And they want to see that you have a plan, you're moving forward, you're executing the plan. And so for us, it has not reduced our bond rating, but at some point I feel like that was going to be on the table if we didn't make a move to correct the action that could eventually affect your bond rating for your city.
One of the, at the last PRB meeting, the Pension Review Board meeting, one of the board members had come to understand that the Longview Pension Fund had signed a memorandum of understanding with the city, and that brought a lot of praise from the PRB members. Kolby, would you tell us a little bit about what that MOU says and what it does for you?
So we felt it was important, and that memorandum of understanding is going to go in the bond covenant as part of the agreement moving forward, was that we didn't want to do all the work that we have done and spend our 15, 20, 25 years on the board trying to correct the problem, get it corrected, and then the next board comes in that is likely the Tier 2 members taking over, and they put us right back into the same situation. So even though the changes that were made in the 90s fit within the acceptable PRB guideline of we did not go past 25 years, I believe it was back then, amortization schedule with the benefit increases they made. They've changed that line to 10 and 20. We felt like that wasn't a strict enough guideline, and we wanted to personally put in our memorandum of understanding that we were going to go to a much stricter guideline of benefit improvements. And that was you couldn't make any benefit changes until you were under 5 years amortization period. Any change could not go above 10 years amortization period, and you had to use 3 consecutive actuarial studies to come up with that. You couldn't have just one good year run out and make a plan change. We didn't spend all this time correcting the problem to go back. I don't know that policemen and Muni and everybody are just like firemen, but the first thing they want to know is, well, can we get rid of Tier 2 and just go back everybody on the same tier? And I said, well, if you got over lung cancer, it doesn't mean you could start smoking again. Sooner or later, you got to put that down and move forward. So it was kind of a pension board ourselves that did not go out to the entire membership for vote. It was a pension board guideline that we wanted to set forth for future boards to understand what we had to do to get out of the problems or the decisions that were honestly made that led us to the problems that we ended up with today, and hopefully guide them into not making those same mistakes in the future.
Yeah, that seemed to be a big issue with Chris Zook on the PRB side, that what he was saying was, I've heard rumblings of this being an option across Texas, and we just want to make sure that pension funds don't get these bonds and then get into the same problems that they were before. So that's obviously a political concern that is I think important for funds to consider. All right, we've got just a few more minutes here. Any questions? Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Kolby, the 7% deferral, is that just on the city contribution, or is that fire as well?
The question was, is the 7% deferral just on the city contribution or on the member also? It is just on the city contribution. The members will continue to contribute at the same 15 or 17% rate that they currently are paying. Yes, so it depends on how you measure that scale. So over the course of 30 years is projected by the actuary, 7% of payroll, of course, is going to grow over the 30 years. $33.3 million at a 2% rate came out to like $46.7 million total payment. total cost of the bond, and projected 7% of payroll over 30 years was $46.8 million. First year payment, the city was going to have to come up with almost $600,000 above what our 7% contribution is, and by the 30th year, they were going to be like $800,000 less than what the bond would be today. So over the life of the loan, yes, 7% of contributions for us was about $1 million. 2 cents on the tax rate is about $1 million, and the payment on the bond at 45.6 is 2.6. So the city was absorbing the other $600,000 out of the general budget.
So does the pension committee board have to approve TOB? No. I mean, what's their role in it?
Just to make your life hard, and if you don't fix your underfunding.
That's really it, right?
Yes.
So they can't veto it or anything like that?
No, no,
Does the legislature have the power to veto a pension obligation bond?
no. Totally up to the cities.
Right. Okay, any other questions?
Is that MOU binding on the future boards?
Well, it's part of the covenant that is going in the bond. So if you were to break the covenant, like the gentleman spoke about earlier, it's the smoke alarm going off that something's going wrong in the deal there. To answer your question, is it legally binding? I would have to defer that to a legal counsel to answer, but as it's part of the covenant, I would say yes, it carries a lot of weight, yes.
Probably be expensive to find out. Okay, yes, sir.
Does any of y'all know how many, over the last 20 years, how many pension obligation bonds have been passed in Texas? Other than Houston, El Paso, and Paso, Longview, how many total? Does anybody have any idea how many of?
I saw a report from 2016, and I think there were 16 that had been passed up to that date, and then, so I guess whatever's been added since that time
In Texas?
in Texas.
I don't know of any between ours and Houston. I never heard of any, so it could have happened prior to that. Dallas.
Dallas in 2005, okay. Okay, we've got 1 minute and 42 seconds, so any last minute? Seeing none, thank you all very much. Thank you, Tyler, Kolby. Appreciate it.